This is the latest installment of US Asia Institute's webinar, Climate Diplomacy at a Crossroads, Southeast Asia Climate Strategy in a Divided Global Order. My name is Katie Zhang, and I am Program Assistant at the US Asia Institute. For those of you who have attended our events in the past, welcome back. And for those who are new to the US Asia Institute, thank you for joining us. USAI is a nonpartisan United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 46-year track record of building understanding and strengthening ties between the people and the governments of the United States and Asia. Today's webinar is part of our Southeast Asia in Focus webinar series. So Southeast Asia in Focus offers unique insights into the US partnerships with Southeast Asian nations through speakers with firsthand knowledge of global power competition in the region. So before we begin, I'd like to recognize our corporate stakeholders. So that's FedEx, Coupang, Suntory, AIG, Akin, Fairfield, Maxwell, Google, or Organon for helping us make programs like this one possible. And so now I would like to introduce our speakers for today, and that is Dr. Muhammad Zulfikar Rakhmat and Miss Cecilia Therese or Niner T. Guiao. So Dr. Muhammad Zulfikar Rakhmat is the director of the China-Indonesia Desk and the Indonesia-MENA Desk at the Center of Economic and Law Studies in Jakarta. He is also a research affiliate at the Middle East Institute of National University of Singapore and a visiting researcher at Busan University of Foreign Studies. He holds an MA in international politics and a PhD in politics from the University of Manchester. Dr. Rahman's research focuses on the dynamics of China-Indonesia Middle East relations, and he has held previous academic and research roles at the Universitas Islam Indonesia and the Institute of Development of Economics and Finance. And Ms. Cecilia Therese is the operations director at Parabukas. She is the deputy executive director of Manwari and is the program head of the International Environmental Law Research Program of the University of the Philippines Institute of International Legal Studies. She holds a JD from the University of the Philippines and an MST in International Relations from the University of Cambridge. And so today we have a great program for you to talk about climate diplomacy in Southeast Asia. And so I'll turn it over to Miss Cecilia to get us started.
Thanks so much, Katie. Good afternoon to everyone, and maybe good morning if you're in my part of the world. I just have a brief presentation on Southeast Asia in general, amidst all of this global changes, shifts, and dynamics. Let me just share my screen and see if it works. Can you see it? Is it visible?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so yeah. So this is my presentation on in relation to the topic, so Southeast Asia's climate strategy in a divided global order. To start off, we do know that Southeast Asia really has an increased risk of climate impact. So it's one of the most vulnerable regions in the world to climate change. And overall, climate change increases the risk of rapid and slow onset disasters in Southeast Asia. So there are expected to be more intense storms. There are already more intense storms, heavy rainfall, and consequent flooding, which result in casualties and economic damages. And in line with that, there is a growing emerging risk trend for displacement and forced migration. So in Indonesia, for example, flood disasters have displaced more people than any other hazard. And in the upper and lower Mekong region, some households have decided to migrate due to harvest failure, so food security concerns caused by flood and drought, among other things. There are other impacts, of course, other causes for displacement and forced migration. These include food security concerns, as mentioned earlier, water security concerns, energy security concerns, health risks, infrastructure concerns, and then environmental risks. So all in all, this is a whole jumble of possible risks and vulnerabilities that increase the likelihood of forced migration and displacement, which are exacerbated by the impact of climate change in the region. Um, in terms of policy, I'm guessing we're all familiar with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. So as of December 2025, all but two ASEAN countries, so that would be Myanmar and my own country, the Philippines, have communicated economy-wide net zero targets, although only two countries have submitted their 2025 NDCs, their 2025 nationally determined contributions. That would be Cambodia and Singapore. All ASEAN countries, for most of them, have conditional targets that are set a little higher than unconditional targets. But almost all, so that would be except Myanmar and Timor-Leste, have chosen to set quantitative economy-wide emissions reductions targets in their latest NDCs. As mentioned earlier, the unconditional targets still are still lower than are still lower, yes, than conditional targets. In the Philippines, for example, the first NDC reflected an overall target of about 75% greenhouse gas emissions reduction, although only 2%, 2 point something percent of this is actually an unconditional target. So the rest is conditioned on the provision of financial resources under the Paris Agreement and the United Nations Framework Agreement on Climate Change. So there has been an assessment of ASEAN's climate ambitions based on their 2021-2022 NDC submissions. And they have said that while most ASEAN countries have added or strengthened their economy-wide targets, some were merely marginal increases. So that's about 2 to 6% in emissions reduction, while there have been others that raised targets by at least 10% or added new economy-wide targets that they previously did not have. So Cambodia, Indonesia, Singapore, and Thailand have submitted long-term greenhouse gas emissions development strategies, which would make it 4 out of the 11 ASEAN countries that have submitted these. And according to estimates, ASEAN will be requiring approximately $1.5 trillion in investments by 2030 to realize its energy transition goals. But there is a significant gap with only $45 billion mobilized in 2021 and 2023. So this underscores the need for stronger regional mechanisms that would attract green investment, encourage capital flows, and align national decarbonization pathways with ASEAN's collective vision for a low-carbon future. Climate and energy policies remain primarily under national jurisdiction in this region, although there is a growing recognition that regional coordination would be able to play a catalytic role in accelerating green transition. So there have been a number of climate governance frameworks and policies, and these include the ASEAN Strategy for Carbon Neutrality, which was back in 2023. It reflects the cross-cutting nature of the climate transition and a more integrated institutional approach across existing sectoral cooperation. There's the ASEAN Taxonomy in 2021, which is a regional guide to define and classify sustainable projects and activities in an attempt to ensure interoperability among ASEAN countries. They are working on an ASEAN regional carbon trading mechanism. There's also the ASEAN multi-sectoral framework for climate change, agriculture and forestry towards food and nutrition security and achievement of SGD. So a lot of words in there. And then there's also the ASEAN Power Grid, which would play a particularly critical role in accelerating the region's renewable energy transition. Between the United States and the ASEAN region, there was a treaty that the U.S. acceded to. So that would be the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia back in 2009. The U.S. was actually the first non-ASEAN country to appoint a resident ambassador. Yeah. So the annual ASEAN-U.S. Summit was institutionalized in 2012, where it is reflected through the plan of action to implement the ASEAN-US Strategic Partnership 2021 to 2025, the mutual commitment of both parties to support ASEAN integration and realize the the master plan, the ASEAN Master Plan for politically cohesive, economically integrated, socially responsible, and a truly people-oriented, people-centered, and rules-based ASEAN. So this includes priority areas such as climate change, so enhancing regional cooperation in addressing the impacts of climate change, natural disasters, energy poverty, other challenges affecting food security, as well as cooperation in biodiversity conservation and implementing the action plan under the ASEAN Working Group on Nature Conservation and Biodiversity. There is also the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which puts forward a set of guiding principles in promoting ASEAN-US cooperation. This includes areas such as maritime cooperation, connectivity, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and economic and other areas of cooperation to contribute to peace, prosperity, and development in the region. In 2025, in May 2025, the shared commitment to continue the comprehensive strategic partnership was reaffirmed between the United States and ASEAN. Although, as we do know, in January 2026, the US declared its exit from the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, and from other international environmental and climate bodies, such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the International Union for Conservation of Nature. The US also stepped back, reneged on its $4 billion pledge to the Green Climate Fund. So for Southeast Asia, the shutdown of US aid left key recipients such as the Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia without crucial funds to implement programs to carry out their climate and development work. For Vietnam and Indonesia, up to $3 billion in support has been cut from existing just energy transition programs, as well as the Surveyor Southeast Asia program, a joint USAID and NASA project providing technology to build climate resilience. It was also was cut as well. So there is a gap that the US leaves in the wake of its retreat from climate action and leadership, which means there is now an opportunity for the dominance of other states. So ASEAN has signaled its intention to avoid succumbing to great power competition by advancing new partnerships, including its growing relationship with Australia. So if going back to the Paris Agreement, for example, there is a provision on South-South cooperation, or at least that leads to the recognition of South-South cooperation under climate policy. So Article 9 of the Paris Agreement said that while developed countries are still to provide financial resources to assist developing country parties with respect to both mitigation and adaptation, this is in continuation of their existing obligations under the convention. Other parties are encouraged to provide or continue to provide such support voluntarily. This particular provision was directed at countries that are still under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change annexes, recognized as developing countries, but are, I suppose, in more realistic terms, not quite developing countries any longer. So since they could not fully dismantle the annexes or the firewall, as they would like to say, between developed and developing countries, this provision makes way for cooperation between developing countries in an attempt to further strengthen climate action. So South-South cooperation has since then extended beyond finance and has gone well into technology transfer and capacity building. For example, in terms of South-South cooperation, there has been a rise in emerging economy climate funds, such as in countries like China, Brazil, India, and the UAE, where they expand climate finance to other developing countries. So there is China's South-South Climate Cooperation Fund, which supports renewable energy, adaptation, early warning systems, and training in Asia, Africa, and small island states. There's India's development partnerships, excuse me, which includes solar projects, climate resilient architecture, technical training, particularly in Africa and South Asia. And there's the UAE's climate finance initiatives, which increase concessional and blended finance provision ahead of and following COP28. So COP28 was hosted in Dubai, UAE, which is why they had a number of presidency initiatives and programs that looked into South-South cooperation and that were started prior to the COP and continued well after. There's also been an expansion of regional development banks in Africa, Latin America, and Asia that have been focusing on green transitions. And there are other newer or strengthened institutions, which include the New Development Bank, which finances renewable energy, transport electrification, and sustainable infrastructure in member states. Excuse me. And the AIIB, which is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which finances large-scale climate and green infrastructure across Asia. There have also been voluntary contributions to the Green Climate Fund by developing countries. So there has been a lot of work happening, a lot of developments in terms of South-South cooperation. In Southeast Asia, it's very apparent that there is a growing Chinese influence in the region. So in 2013, China began enhancing its global influence through its Belt and Road Initiative, which was to enhance geoeconomic connectivity. So under its vision for South-South cooperation, climate action has been integrated into this initiative. So particularly in Southeast Asia, China is actually one of the largest investors in the region. Lower income economies such as Laos and Cambodia are heavily reliant on Chinese climate finance and technology now, particularly for hydropower and grid infrastructure, which means China has quite a substantial influence over their energy systems. There are a number of perceived risks in relation to this. So these include supply chain concentration, debt traps, and risks to national sovereignty, which means more developing countries have adopted a slightly more cautious approach by diversifying partnerships with other countries or other partners while still welcoming Chinese finance and technology. So in terms of moving forward, Southeast Asian policymakers may consider striking a balance between safeguarding national interests and leveraging partnership opportunities. This could include strengthening ASEAN unity and negotiating power. There's also enhancing local capacity and supply chains at the national level, encouraging particular cooperation between ASEAN member states, and insisting on transparency, good governance, and robust environmental and social safeguards. That's it for me from now. I hope that was helpful. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Cecilia. And then now we're gonna turn our attention to Dr. Muhammad Zulfikar Rakhmat for his discussion on Indonesia and global climate diplomacy.
Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon for those who are in the States, and good morning for those in Asia. Let me turn on my video. All right, so I'm going to talk specifically on Indonesia and how Indonesia navigates the climate funding competition between China, the US, and also other actors as well. So in general, when it comes to Indonesia, we have Indonesia has pledged to pursue net zero emission by 2060 or earlier. And recently, Indonesia has submitted an updated second nationally determined contribution highlighting enhanced mitigation and adaptation ambition. And now the current leadership aims to reduce their carbon emission, as well as developing a domestic carbon market. And when it comes to leadership, Indonesia has actually tried to do a global leadership engagement when it comes to climate, where we actively present our climate commitment at major forums like the COP30, as well as other forums as well, and the government has urged more ambitious climate diplomacy as part of foreign policy. And when it comes to other countries, Indonesia has signed several climate cooperation agreements beyond China and the US, as well as with the European countries like the UK as well, to advance several agreements on climate mitigation. However, the problem is that we are still depending heavily on coal, despite our renewable potential in solar, in hydro. Indonesia still depends heavily on coal. 70% of electricity comes from coal, and the key pillar of our economy is also on coal. And this coal dependency have increased tension between economic growth, energy security, and climate commitment. And now with the current president, uh, 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 there seems to debate whether energy transition or climate commitment is still a priority, given that the president has mentioned that the main priority now is self-sufficiency, mainly on food security as well as energy security. That's why renewable energy has not become a major priority under Prabowo's administration. However, when we talk about climate and energy transition, it requires a lot of finance, including closing a multi-billion dollar investment gap for renewable transmission and storage. And Indonesia is one of the recipients of JETP, Just Energy Transition Partnership, which is, I'm sure all of you know, that it is a cooperation mechanism with G7 countries, including the US, targeting a coal phase down and clean energy shift. However, the problem with JETP is that the money has been very slow. The funding has been very slow, although the Indonesian government has established a specific agency on JP, but a lot of people believe that the funding has been very slow. And then comes China. I think Niner mentioned about this earlier. Indonesia and China maintain a comprehensive partnership agreement, among others, also focusing on energy transition. The problem with Indonesian government is that they like everything quickly. So they prefer fast money rather than clean and more responsible money. So that's why China has come in the front as an alternative for the Indonesian government, mainly due to its quick funding. Although a lot of problems is that come from the fact that the fast funding also does not include a better safeguard mechanism. That's why a lot of problems associated with Chinese investment is that we have environmental impact, labor tensions, as well as other issues as well related to dependency and then debt as well. And just recently, for example, maybe you all know that China is dominating our nickel mining. and 90% of our nickel is dominated by Chinese companies. However, this week a news was emerged that saying that Chinese companies never report their investment to the Indonesian government. So this kind of a reporting mechanism, safeguard mechanism, is not really present in the Chinese investment and climate activities in Indonesia. When it comes to the United States, we have signed several agreements. As I mentioned earlier, the most important thing is the JETP, Just Energy Transition Partnership. And then under the prior Indonesian president, we have signed ASEAN-US cooperation on climate finance, energy transition, and green investment. However, the problem is that again, the JETP disbursement issues and then broader climate finance flow have created gaps that Indonesia must navigate. And then the US has sometimes emphasized natural gas export, which complicate Indonesia's decarbonization strategy. Another issue is that a lot of people believe that China is dominating our nickel industry out of nowhere. No, the problem is that the Indonesian government has several times invited the US to invest in our nickel industry, but some of the decision has been blocked by the Congress. So that's why, because of that, China or Indonesia have then opted China as an alternative. And what I think what Indonesia now has been doing is that Indonesia has navigated a divided climate order by pursuing collaboration with other actors, including the European countries, as well as now the MENA region or the Middle East and North Africa. Niner was mentioning about the UAE. Now, most of the funding in the climate sector also comes from Middle Eastern countries like Qatar or the UAE. However, the problem with the Middle Eastern funding is that it sometimes stops at the commitment level. So they have committed several funding, but usually the implementation is lacking. The implementation is not very clear. And when it comes to ASEAN, I think, especially the role of ASEAN, I think Indonesia champions ASEAN climate diplomacy, including, collective statement, joint statement, and regional initiative like the ASEAN Center for Climate Change. And when Indonesia was the ASEAN chair, Indonesia has pushed for regional climate finance, technology transfer, and cooperation mechanism. But again, now in the past 1 year, after Prabowo being inaugurated in the office, the question about climate commitment became questionable because it seems not really to be his main priority. And I think one of the most important aspects that Indonesia needs to do is that Indonesia should diversify their cooperation, not only with major power like China or the US, but also with other actors like Japan or South Korea. And then uh, another thing that I think still a homework for Indonesia is to ensure that agreement could lead to measurable climate outcomes. Many of the agreements on the climate with any actors is that it stopped at the commitment level, as I mentioned earlier, or at the agreement level, but the implementation is lacking. And then Indonesia, I think, should use its position in ASEAN to catalyze broader ASEAN climate action. But this is also questionable given the fact that under the current president, ASEAN is not really a priority. The majority of our foreign policy now is conducted bilaterally rather than regionally or multilaterally because Prabowo has mentioned that he preferred bilateral cooperation instead of multilateral or regional cooperation. And when it comes to domestic context, I think Indonesia need to strengthen its policy between emission goal, energy and economic planning, and building institutional capacity for tracking climate finance, project pipeline, and a carbon market implementation. And when it comes to China, I think there is a special homework that Indonesia needs to do, which is to negotiate climate cooperation that also include technology transfer, standard alignment, transparent project evaluation, because so far this has not really been happening, especially in Chinese investment in Indonesia. When it comes to the US, I believe that revitalizing ZP is very important, as well as other multilateral financing vehicle with clearer, predictable distribution and green condition, as well as leveraging ASEAN forums to coordinate climate commitment and collective bargaining. So I think in conclusion, what I want to say is that Indonesia stands at the intersection, at a very important intersection of global climate diplomacy, and I believe that its choices will shape the region climate resilience and access to finance and technology. And I think balancing partnership with other actors and not relying so much on China and as well as enhancing regional cooperation is very important for Indonesia to be a leader in the climate governance and not just a recipient of climate cooperation. So I think that's it for my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Um, Thank you to both of our speakers. And so we're going to be moving towards the Q&A portion first with our moderated Q&A and then audience Q&A. So if you all have questions in the audience, please put them in the chat. But right now, I'm going to introduce our moderator for today, Murray Huber. Mr. Huber is a senior associate of the Southeast Asia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and he's also the head of research at Bauer Asia Group. Prior to joining CSIS, Mr. Hebert was the senior director for Southeast Asia at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and he has also worked for Wall Street Journal, Asia, and the Far Eastern Economic Review, reporting on U.S.-Asia relations. We are so grateful for Mr. Hebert for participating in today's discussion. So without further ado, I'll pass it over for him to moderate our Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Katie. I'm really sorry that I'm here late. I was in a room, but it was the wrong room. Sorry about that. And I'm sorry I missed the beginning of Cecilia's talk. But, you know, as both of you were talking a lot about the challenges now facing getting funding for projects, getting support for better regulations, better policies to support environmental protection, climate change mitigation. But you've also talked about the challenges of U.S. cutting funding, and I want to focus on that for a minute. So, the U.S., as Cecilia said, pulled out of COP and had pulled out of all kinds of other international engagements. It also closed USAID that provided a lot of funding for small, at least local projects. So in this context, and the U.S. has stopped focusing on carbon emissions and all that stuff. It's fine. It's just a hoax, right? So I'm wondering, this is the shadow that's hanging over the whole climate uh, conversation, the whole all the climate efforts right now. There's the big elephant in the room has left the room totally, and I'm wondering how big of a damper that is. Is it just a little bit of a damper, or is it really just sucking the oxygen out of the room for almost all efforts right now? And then to segue into the other question is, of course, China is, and Zulkifar Ifkar, I can't pronounce your name. I'm very sorry. Um, uh, Raised the whole question about China. Can China fill in the gap? And it sounded like maybe not. It wants to finance a lot of projects, but really not all the projects are on target, and it's still selling coal burning power plants to Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Indonesia, etc. Thank you. It's a long, rambling question, but we're in a very complicated outside environment that it's not only um, driven by Southeast Asia. Cecilia, you want to start?
Sure. It's a difficult question to answer. So we're getting right into it, I guess. Right. So definitely the U.S. Stepping back out of climate action has had a huge impact. I've been primarily following the climate negotiations since 2012. And it's a very, very different atmosphere now than it was before with the US actively participating. Um, in some ways, it makes conversations easier because there is less of a pushback between developed and developing countries. So it's in some ways easier for developed and developing countries to come to agreement on certain topics. But of course, when it comes to finance, the provision of finance, and other means of implementation, the lack of the US's absence in the room is deeply felt. In recent years, I think this was last year, the new quantitative goal on climate finance was reached. Quantitative goal rather on climate finance was reached, and it was markedly lower from what it was, well, what countries ambitioned for it to be, what they hoped it would be. And this is one sign of the US's absence, because discussions within the climate circles among the negotiators clearly reflected that the absence of the US. So they were saying that they could perhaps commit to a higher target if the US were in the room as well, and if they could shoulder some of the costs of financial support. But as it wasn't, they couldn't really put together all of the expenses or all of the finances that would be necessary to meet climate action. So that was really very clear during those negotiations. So yeah, so in some ways it's easier with less people speaking against developing country priorities, for example. But it's also harder because this has their lack or their absence has a direct impact on ambition, or reaching or increasing ambition rather, in terms of climate action. In terms of China, so yes, I think the at least speaking from the Philippine perspective, China is definitely growing to be a bigger and bigger actor in the region. Um, the concern, of course, is the Philippines in particular does have some territorial disputes with China. There have been administrations in this country that have been particularly supportive of China, and there are some that are not. Um, so there are concerns currently being raised in relation to the receipt of financial support from that country. It's important, I suppose, to decouple sectors that have been receiving support as opposed to coming at it as a whole like national approach. But one of the things our country is particularly wary of are debt traps. There have been a lot of funds coming in from China into various developing countries, again, as part of South-South cooperation. But there are some prices to pay that some countries don't realize are on the table until too late. And this is something that a lot of people in the Philippines realized as well after the end of the previous administration. So I think there are advantages, especially as my colleague here said, the finances come faster when they come from China. They flow faster, but there are also some prices to pay that might need a little more thought and a little less speed when it comes to consideration.
Zulfikar, how do you see it?
Yes, I agree with Leonard that it's been felt significantly in two ways, in my opinion. Number one is that the government who, Prabhu is very much looking up to the US as an exemplar. And the fact that the US has withdrawn from many of the commitment has made the government to some extent justify their decision not to pay attention so much on climate. Like they're saying, if the US is doing it, then I should do it as well. So that's the problem that we face. The second thing is that energy transition and climate change used to be a crowded space for CSOs, and now a lot of CSOs focusing on climate issues have decreased significantly due to the lack of funding and the lack of you can say guidance, because many of the organizations like USAID, NDI have withdrawn their funding in Indonesia. When it comes to China, we recently carried out a survey on various issues in relation to China-Indonesia. And one of the questions that we asked is whether China could be a partner for Indonesia's energy transition. 70% of respondents say yes. And when we ask why, their answer is funding, quick funding. So even at the public level, and the survey was conducted at the public level, not at the elite level. So even at the public level, people believe that China has been able to provide faster funding with less commitments. But again, I think a lot of CSOs understand that with faster funding also comes, lack of safeguard for communities, for environment, and so on and so forth. So I think in general is that China is seen as an opportunity, but at the same time as a threat. As an opportunity due to the quick funding, as a threat because China is known as an actor with less responsibility when it comes to community safeguarding, environmental protection, and so on and so forth.
Thank you very much. Katie, I don't know if there are questions in the chat. I saw a few come up. Maybe we should give some time for those.
Yes, sounds good. There's one I see in the chat right now.
Okay.
Do you want me to read it?
Please, because I can't see it.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay. Can Dr. Zulfikar, can you elaborate on the Indonesian administration's focus on domestic concerns rather than multilateral climate initiatives?
All right. So, in our opinion, is that there is a change of policy focus from Jokowi administration to Prabowo administration. During Jokowi administration, the focuses were two: infrastructure and downstreaming. And that's where the nickel mining comes in and why China is dominating and so on and so forth. Under Prabowo administration, and this is also factored by the fact that he is a strong leader with military background. One of his commitment now is self-sufficiency. And when it comes to self-sufficiency, he has mentioned two sectors that is very important. Number one is food security, and number two is energy security. When it comes to energy security, he has mentioned it several times that we have a lot of coal. Why don't we use it?
Mhm.
You know, he mentioned that several times. So that's why, in our opinion, is that Prabhu's commitment on multilateral climate initiative have not been his policy focus, at least in the past year, during his first year term. And this can also be seen in in our engagement with China in the past year as well. The focus has moved, uh, although now nickel, I mean, China is still dominating the nickel industry, but most of the talk between Prabowo and China has been on food sector, free meal program, and so on and so forth, as well as on uh, coal and even this month, the news is that China is now investing or putting new investment on oil and gas. So in 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 our opinion is that our climate commitment is now downsliding instead of moving forward, because that's Prabowo's priority now. Yeah, I hope it answers the question.
Great. Thank you. So Katie, are we out of time or you want to go a little longer or what's your?
I think we have time for maybe one more question. And I think it's for all of our speakers and moderator included if you would like. But do you see global discussions around tariffs impacting climate-related technology transfers? And if so, how? And this will be our last question for today.
Cecilia, are you ready to
Sure.
tackle that?
I'm ready to share some thoughts. I don't know if it's going to be helpful. But yeah, so there have been, I do acknowledge that there have been a lot of global discussions around tariffs in relation to climate change in particular. The Philippines is actually going through an extensive study on tariffs in relation to climate change. And this will definitely be impacting many, many sectors in our economy. The question right now that the Philippines is diving into, I'm actually part of another project in relation to trade and climate change, is what sectors should be prioritized, and what really should the trade and climate change plan be for the country. So it's right now, I think, finding the Philippines' identity in relation to trade and climate change and how it wants to deal with it. especially as it's become this looming issue that will need to be addressed. In relation to technology transfers in particular, I find this interesting because in conversations at the climate negotiations, they often talk about innovative finance solutions. And I recall that during the Paris Agreement negotiations, one suggestion that was made by India, if I'm not mistaken, is looking into technology as a possible source of innovative finance. So technology would be, in particular, patents and other technology-related expenses to be considered as waived or as paid for, or I guess in kind through Paris Agreement or UNFCCC commitments. So it's one way to deal with financing flowing into developing countries, given that patents usually, when it comes to technology transfer, patents are really a big thing to contend with. So putting all that together, I think it's worthwhile exploring what your country's identity would be, what its priorities would be in relation to trade and climate, and then looking into how this could possibly feed into a climate finance perspective or a climate finance plan that would include more technology transfer that would be more accessible to a lot of sectors in society.
Zulfikar, you have some?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Definitely, because our cooperation with the US has been focusing on technology, among others. So tariffs have definitely impacted the technological cooperation between Indonesia and the US, including in the climate sectors. And one of the scariest thing now is that China is dominating the technology sector, including in the climate and also telecommunication. And we have heard many negative implications of using Chinese technology, and I think if the United States doesn't step up on this, I think there is a possibility that China would further dominate the technological aspect of climate initiatives, which I think will make countries like Indonesia more and more dependent on China. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, Katie, I'll just make a brief comment. I work a lot on the tariffs and from the Washington side and I watch very carefully what's happening with Southeast Asia. And I know Indonesia and the Philippines still haven't signed a final agreement. Only two countries in Southeast Asia, Malaysia and Cambodia, have. So the main purpose of these tariffs is to knock down to countries, to lower the trade with the exports from countries that have big trade surpluses. And actually, neither Indonesia or the Philippines have very big trade surpluses. They're not like Vietnam that has over $100 billion a year in trade surplus. But the goal is to get US products into your countries easier and to make it harder for your products to get into the United States. And so actually neither of those US companies are not clamoring to export right now technology for climate mitigation, and neither are Southeast Asia countries trying to get into the US. It's more aimed at like China, which is trying to sell cheap solar panels and wind technology. But it is obviously another factor that's affecting cooperation a great deal. Katie, please, you wrap it up.
I just want to say thank you so much to both our audience, our speakers, our moderators. You all were very, very insightful, and we would please reach out to us and we'd be happy in assisting fostering further dialogue and anything that we discussed today. So thank you all for joining us and have a great day.
Thank
Have
you
a
so
good night,
much.
you
Thank
guys
you.
in Asia.
Bye
Thanks. I'm
bye.
going to bed now.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Okay, good night.
everybody.
Bye bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.